Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, if you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Please also consider going to our website and donating $20.25 for our 2025 fundraising campaign. Visit the Film Florida merchandise page at filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. All merchandise proceeds go to the Film Florida Filmmaker Grant and Scholarship Fund. Stefan Roesch emigrated to New Zealand in 2003 to embark on the world's first PhD in film tourism. Since then, he has 20 years of experience in market research and is a leading expert on film tourism and has consulted with various destinations on film tourism projects around the world. In 2023, he earned the designation of Certified Film Commissioner and is on the board of directors for the Association of Film Commissioners International. We talked to Stefan about the origins of film tourism, where his interest started, the global economic impacts of film tourism, and more on this episode of the Film Florida podcast. Here's my conversation with Stefan Roesch. Welcome to the Film Florida podcast, Stefan.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here. Looking forward to this.
So let's start at the beginning. Give us your origin story.
Born and bred in Munich, in Germany, which, sorry, I'm a little bit biased, but I do think it's one of the prettiest areas in Germany. We, of course, as Bavarians, have the best beer, the best sausages. When I was 1 year old, we moved to the Bavarian countryside, about 1.5 hours north, near Nuremberg, which is sort of a 500,000 city. Yeah, it's a lovely area with forested rolling hills, perfect mountain bike country. So this is where I went to high school. After high school, I decided to study tourism geography, which kind of set me on the path of where I am now.
So, as one of the world's leading film tourism specialists, let's define film tourism for the listeners and talk about how you became interested in this specific field.
So there are different definitions out there. You might have come across film tourism. Some people refer to it as movie tourism or screen tourism or film location tourism. On my part, I tend to make a clear distinction between, on one hand, film-induced tourism, or you could also say screen-induced tourism. And that is essentially the mechanism where someone watches a movie or a TV show and falls in love with a place that's portrayed on screen. So think Lord of the Rings in New Zealand. So you base your next travel decision on going to that portrayed place, which is New Zealand, but you don't necessarily want to see the exact filming spots. And that's where film location tourism comes in. So you have a certain percentage of film-induced tourists who want to go to see exactly where something was filmed and the characters were walking through the screen. As in, how did I get involved? Really, the impetus was back in 2002 when the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, end of 2001, beginning of 2002. I came across an article, and that article talked about film fanatics traveling all the way to New Zealand to see the locations from the movie, yet all the sets had been taken away after filming was finished. So I was thinking, why would you pay thousands of dollars to travel all the way to New Zealand and go to places that are hard to find? Essentially, we're talking a paddock, and there's some mountains in the background, some thorn bushes, some rock formations. Very hard to identify the real spot. And then also I thought, when you get there, what do you do when you're on location? Like, is this something that's special to those people? So long story short, I thought, okay, I need to look into this. And I've always had a keen interest in doing more research after my studies. So essentially what happened was I applied for scholarship at a New Zealand university, got accepted, and then went from Germany, I was working at the time, to New Zealand to do a 3-year study for a PhD in movie tourism. And it was essentially the world's first.
And now, as you mentioned, born in Germany, but now when that all started, you're in New Zealand. You've since stayed there, and you've presented at film tourism conferences around the world to inform people about the topic. Have you seen, or how have you seen a greater understanding of film tourism and the various, definitions of it impact different regions throughout the world?
Absolutely. I've presented at over 50 different conferences or events, and I could literally see, starting back in 2007 with those presentations and talks, how film tourism has grown exponentially around the world. And there's more and more awareness with destination marketeers, what film tourism can do to you. Because the bottom line is, in many cases, it's money can't buy marketing opportunity for your destination. And also it distinguishes you from other destinations. So, many regions around the world promote themselves on the back of the local food and cuisine, natural assets, activities you can do, but essentially you can buy in many countries. You have great food in many countries, but there's only one Lord of the Rings, there's only one Game of Thrones.
Sure.
So it really distinguishes you from your competitors. Yeah, and also when you look at the numbers, how film tourism has grown, it's phenomenal.
And based on your research, is there one kind of area that jumped on board with this sooner than others throughout in the world?
My prime example is always the UK, and the National Tourism Organization is called Visit Britain. I would say they were the early pioneers, dating back to the mid 90s. I believe it was 1996 when they published the first movie map. So that was a printed map, not online. And ever since that time, again and again, they've invested into film tourism campaigns, one of which I was involved in. It was on the first Paddington movie. And that was also a great example of when you come in early, how many opportunities you have to work with a production company. Because what essentially happened was Visit Britain said to me, we're thinking of creating a family focused tourism campaign. We've never done it before. Can you help us? If it goes wrong, of course, I would have been the bad guy. The consultant is always the bad guy.
Right.
But how the process went about was me reading the script and analyzing it for any indicators that Paddington could be a great vehicle to promote tourism for the UK. And I was literally locked into a room. I wasn't allowed to take anything into the room in terms of a notepad, pens, went through the script, and then I went back to Visit Britain and said, hey, this is a no-brainer. And that was about, I believe, half a year before filming took place. So there was a long lead in time
Mm,
to for Visit Britain to approach Studio Canal, which was the production company, to say, hey, can we collaborate on a tourism campaign? We think, there's huge benefits for both sides. And what followed was essentially a negotiation um, around what was Studio Canal, the production company, prepared to hand over to Visit Britain in terms of IP. And in return, Visit Britain offered to promote the movie on their channels. And it was a great success.
interesting. Now, you're also on the board of the Association of Film Commissioners International, AFCI. Tell us a little bit about the organization and your time with AFCI.
Sure. So, yes, I was selected onto the board in January, and it's coming up to 50 years. So it's quite a traditional organization if you think in terms of, a film tourism body. So it was established in 1975, and essentially it's the member organization for regional film offices and commissions worldwide. So we have a bit more over 300 members, and it's all about knowledge sharing, skill development, and connection. And we are on a really exciting journey at the moment with our executive director and the board in terms of a new strategy we're currently implementing, working closer with the major studios most of which are on our advisory board. And one of the things I'm really looking forward to is developing a new digital platform where we can connect film commissions, film offices, and producers, production companies, studios in a much more interactive and engaging way. And last but not least, we've got our 50th anniversary, and that will be celebrated in Cincinnati.
Excellent. So, in addition to all of your great work, you offer other consulting through things like tourism-focused script analysis. Tell us a little bit more about your consulting and research work that you're still doing.
Yep. So it's something I do as a side job. So I've been doing consulting since I mentioned it before, 2007, with many destinations around the world. Think, as I said, Visit Britain and Paddington. I developed the national strategy for the country of Jordan around screen tourism. I've worked with Tourism Northern Ireland on Game of Thrones, advised Tourism Ireland on Star Wars, Visit Britain, Visit Denmark on Trolls. So lots of different projects. And really, I offer a range of different consulting services. And that goes from implementation of film-focused management structures to feasibility studies, film place branding, all the way to analyzing scripts and also creating film tourism experiences, which is sort of my favorite part. Because what tends to happen in screen-focused destination marketing is that everyone wants to attract film tourists because they tend to stay longer in the region and they tend to spend more money than other tourists.
Okay.
But when they get to your destination, what do you do with them? So either you send them on their way, hoping that they will find locations themselves and are prepared to do that, or you have to essentially give them an experience.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I come into play and consult on how to create really meaningful, professional, impactful experiences for film fans.
That's really interesting. Now, being in Florida, of course, we certainly know the economic benefits of tourism as it's our state's number one industry. But talk about the volume of film tourism, the market of that globally.
So the current numbers suggest that as of 2023, the global market was valued at about $66 billion,
Wow.
with growth rates projected of being around 5 to 8%. There's a lot of growth happening in some Asian countries, China, South Korea, Japan, also India, think Bollywood. Um, Obviously, one of the key drivers has been the rise of the streamers
Sure.
and the increase in content. That also contributed to more places screened that are perhaps lesser known and not really on the radar for travelers.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said before, because more and more countries are incorporating screen into the tourism strategies, it's much better marketed. So by 2030, the estimate is that we'll reach around 120 US billion in terms of revenue.
Wow.
So it's slowly coming out of a niche, I would say. We can say that.
Yes, it is no longer a niche. It's no longer a unicorn, which I have been told a few times film tourism is. So, I mean, our organization here in Florida, we talk about film tourism a lot, but I don't think people fully understand kind of the broad reach. And you mentioned a little bit of it earlier, but what are some examples of the economic impact of film tourism?
Okay, so let's start with my home country, New Zealand. When the original Lord of the Rings trilogy came out, tourism increased by 40%.
Wow.
And we're talking 620 million New Zealand dollars annually for the economy. That's about 300 million US. And of course, this is a globally known trilogy with a huge following. But then you have other examples like Game of Thrones, where Dubrovnik, city in Croatia, which was heavily screened in the show, saw a 30% increase in tourism, which in this case, there were concerns about overcrowding,
Mm-hmm.
and that can happen with film tourism. So you've got to manage that. And it's best to manage that in advance. And there are many more examples. One example I really love in terms of longevity is around The Sound of Music.
Sure.
And when you think about it, it was released in 1965, yet still today, more than 50 years after release, we still see 300,000 international visitors coming to Salzburg, a city in Austria, which is the main location, to partake in a Sound of Music experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole range of different experiences. You can hop on a location tour, you can go to a theater play, a puppet show. You can even partake in apple strudel cooking lessons. So they've really, really marketed themselves as Sound of Music City and Sound of Music Country in Salzburg.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Now, as an expert in the field, we obviously know that film tourism is a thing. It's a big thing, but help us understand kind of the profile and the motivations of film tourists themselves.
So on one hand, you've got the super fans, as I call them. Super fans, think of people who watch a movie or a show over and over and over. They know pretty much every single line of dialogue. And when those people decide to go on a location, on a film location, they dress up as the beloved characters. They come prepared as in they know exactly how to find specific locations. They want to recreate scenes of the beloved characters. They pose for photos as their beloved characters. Think the elven warrior Legolas in Lord of the Rings. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
very iconic location in New Zealand where he's standing on a rock, looking over the landscape, and he sees some orcs in the distance. And Legolas standing on that rock is one of those iconic shots. Or another iconic shot would be when Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, he walks out of his home into the desert and then looks towards the horizon, and we can see the twin suns of Tatooine going down.
Mm-hmm.
So that location and that famed sort of igloo-shaped structure still exists today. So you can go to the Tunisian desert and you're literally standing on Tatooine.
Mm.
And that's a magical moment for those super fans.
Sure.
So back in 2005, I traveled to Tunisia with a Belgian Star Wars fan club. And of course, we had to go to that famous Luke Skywalker location when the sun was going down over the Tunisian desert. So it would look exactly like it does in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had people crying. Someone said to me, I literally was Luke Skywalker in that moment. So you could almost say it's like a holy pilgrimage for those people.
Yeah.
But in saying that super fans only make up a certain small percentage of people who are film induced. So I would say the vast majority are people who have seen a movie, a show, have fallen in love with the place, the location. For instance, travel to New Zealand, but they just want to experience New Zealand as a travel destination. It's culture, it's people. And, sometimes you drive through the landscape and you have the feeling, wow, this kind of looks like Middle Earth. But as I said at the very beginning, you don't necessarily want to go to the specific film locations. So those are really the people you want to attract because that is the majority of film-induced tourists.
Right.
And then there's incidental film location tourists. So you might drive through Scotland with your rental car, and then you come across the Island Donan Castle, which is a beautiful castle in an inlet near the Isle of Skye. And then you might realize, oh my God, this is the famous castle from Highlander. I had no idea that
Mm-hmm.
this is it. So you probably got to stop and look at the castle, not because you're interested, well, you are interested in the real history, but the sort of the pull factor is the fact that it's the Highlander castle. So there's different motivations and different types of film-induced tourists.
Well, and as you're going through those, that makes a lot of sense because here in Florida, some of the biggest examples we have are Dolphin Tale and Dolphin Tale 2, which was based at the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, which was obviously a very specific location, whereas Bloodline, a television series that was on Netflix, was all over the Florida Keys. And so when you say the different types of people, obviously people that are going to the Clearwater Marine Aquarium are going for a very specific location, a very specific thing, as opposed to people that are going to a geographic area that's much larger, and they just want to go there because they saw bits and pieces of it. So I've never thought about it that way, but it does make a lot of sense. And so what are some of the best practice examples of high quality film tourism experiences?
Look, I've been on quite a few so-called film location tours,
Uh-huh.
and what tends to happen is you're put on a bus and they drive you through the landscape, and then the guide points out certain features in the landscape and goes, such and such was filmed over here, this scene was filmed over there, and you might watch one or two scenes on a monitor on a screen on the bus, but actually this is not meaningful at all.
Right.
So sometimes you don't even get out of the vehicle. What the fans want. And when I say fans, the interesting thing is I did some tour guiding myself for Lord of the Rings fans for a tour company here in the South Island. And the majority of people on my tour, and we're talking a full day tour, 8 hours, small van, 10 people, the majority were not fans of Lord of the Rings.
Mm.
And I say to them, why are you on this tour? Some hadn't read the books or even seen the movies. And they said, well, it's something different. I've never done a film location tour, but also movie people always find beautiful places. And additionally, they wanted to know, okay, how do you actually film on location? Most people don't know too much about filming. So it was about giving them snippets around, how many crew do you actually need on location?
Mm.
What's the setup? As you know, you need lots of different vehicles. It's big sized crew. How do you hide certain features that you don't want to see on screen in terms of, camera techniques? So long story short, when you create a location experience, first of all, you have to cater for the different types of tourists on your tour. So it can't just be all about recreating scenes for super fans and everyone else on the tour doesn't quite understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, you always need to give visual cues. So even sometimes super fans are not entirely sure when you show them a location of what happened in the scene. So for instance, we had just print out stills, and we would hold them up against the landscape and point out certain features. And that's the proof that is the authentic location.
Right.
And then we would encourage things like, as I said before, posing as Legolas, recreating some scenes. Sometimes the guides would do it. Sometimes we did it with the guests. But then you also have to incorporate other elements in the tour. So that could be, having a lovely lunch, local cuisine. We always stopped at the bungee bridge just for some extra fun. When we had time, we would do some wine tasting because what you find is that film-induced tourists, super fans or not, they are highly engaged with the host culture.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to be very educated, very open-minded, interested. As I said before, they tend to stay longer in a destination, tend to spend more money. So you have to cater for all of this, and you need to get out of the bloody vehicle. Okay, don't stay on the bus and just point out scenes. This is not what film fans want. And we had also props and costumes with us. So, of course, that's always a highlight when you dress up as one of the hobbits and the guide takes a photo of you at a Lord of the Rings location. But there are other film tourism experiences which are not tours. I would say one of my favorite ones is a Martian style overnight stay in the desert Wadi Rum in Jordan,
Mm.
where a very clever businessman set up about, I think, a dozen tents that look very Martian style. And literally, when you wake up in the morning, you feel like you are on Mars.
Mm.
So, you just got to be creative and think about how you can find a connection with the movie and make it work for your business and the fans. And sometimes the tricky part is, or in most cases, you might not have the necessary budget to pay for the film related IP. So you have to find a workaround,
Yeah.
right? So you can't, name the movie title. You can't have anything in your marketing material that uses the film IP, but there's ways to work around it.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think too much about the IP part of it. Yeah. Now, a great example of film tourism is something you've mentioned a number of times for global audience, and that's Game of Thrones. You delivered a keynote on this very case study a few years ago. Can you share some of the impact that the region has experienced after the release of the films?
Sure. So Tourism Northern Ireland, in fact, they asked me before I gave the keynote if I could come visit, look at the different locations,
Mm,
especially the most iconic ones, and help them develop or improve, I should say, certain film tourism experiences, which is what I did. I also did a workshop for tour guides, how to provide high quality film tourism experiences for Thronies. And yeah, Tourism Northern Ireland, they did a great job in cashing in on the success of the show in terms of attracting additional tourists that otherwise would not have come. And we're talking, horseback riding, Game of Thrones style banquets, location tours, archery lessons where the main characters practice the archery in season one. So, whole range of different experiences. I would say one of my favorites was a campaign called Doors of Thrones. It was incredibly clever. So, what happened was a big storm going through one of the main locations, or the most iconic locations, which is essentially a row of trees along a country lane. Some of the trees were knocked down. And what the tourism marketeers came up with was to carve 10 bespoke doors out of that wood with motifs from season six. And then they placed those doors in different pubs all across the country.
mm.
And then the idea was, okay, let's put the doors in for a year. And I believe that's how the story goes. Some of the pub owners were a bit skeptical and were like, yeah, okay, let's do it for a year. It's not going to do much. What do you think happened?
I'm betting that it was a massive photo op for everybody that walked into the pubs.
No brainer, right?
Sure,
Most of the pubs essentially had no connection to Game of Thrones prior to putting the doors in. They turned into pilgrimage sites.
sure.
And what was also clever is because the doors were placed in pubs all across the country, you would achieve regional spread. So the thronies would not just go to the film locations, which are clustered in the north and the west, but they would travel across the country to see all the different doors. And essentially, Game of Thrones has transformed Northern Ireland into a film tourism hotspot. There's now also a studio tour you can do. It is estimated that Game of Thrones has injected about 50 million pounds per year on top of existing tourism. So big success story.
Yeah, I would imagine those doors is kind of like passport photos. People want to go to each one of them, and therefore they're traveling all over the place and spending money and then getting their pictures and posting those pictures online, and it becomes a cyclical thing there through the whole thing.
Well, actually, it's funny that you mentioned that, John, because for a while, and I'm not sure if that's still the case, there was an initiative where you could get a passport from tourism bodies, like different information sites. You would pick up your passport and then you would get it stamped at each door. And then in the end, you would get a little present.
Exactly. So I've read some really crazy film tourism locations that people you would think never want to go there, and there they are, going there. In your opinion, what's kind of the oddest example of film tourism?
I'm not sure if I would use the word odd, but coming back to when I was tour guiding myself,
How about unexpected?
unexpected is great. I had someone proposing on location. And that was a really interesting moment because I also had non-super fans on the tour, as I said before. And you might think this could be a bit awkward for everyone and a little bit as we say, dorky, but it was a very special moment for everyone. And I think because there was such an understanding of what it means to be a super fan. And look, there were a lot of people on my tours who were a bit skeptical in the first place, going on a tour like this.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of each single tour, they said, wow, this was really interesting. And when I get home, the first thing I'm going to do is watch that film, and then I can say I was there.
Yeah.
So you are literally transforming people from not knowing anything about the movies, the books, to fans. And of course, they will tell everyone else, look, hey, I was in New Zealand, I was in Lord of the Rings, let's watch it together. So what I'm saying is unexpected for me at the time was how transformative a film experience can be on location. And that goes for many other examples. Star Wars fans, as I said to you before, going to Tunisia to see the sun going down. And super fandom also means, in the case of Star Wars, that we had a group of people going to Tunisia when this famous film set started to fall apart to renovate it.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that's now happened twice over the past 20 years. So you can find lots of examples where people go to very remote locations, but the principle is always the same. It's this longing to connect with your beloved characters, with your beloved fantasy world, and be in this film. And if it's just for a split second.
Well, and I even read an article once that talked about people going to visit the site of the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown after the HBO miniseries came out on it because they wanted to go see that. And I thought to myself, of all places that people would want to go visit, at the site of a nuclear meltdown, it was not on my bingo card to think that that's where people would go for film tourism.
Just as an interesting side aspect, I couldn't agree more. Sometimes I get asked by destination marketeers what I think around movies or shows that sort of have a dark undertone to
Yes.
them,
Yes.
or a genre that wouldn't lend itself to tourism promotion, such as a thriller or a horror movie. But there are plenty of examples, as you just mentioned, where something that's supposedly not good for attracting visitors in fact does the opposite. And Blair Witch Project, the main town, I think it was called Burkittsville. I'm not entirely sure. I think so. Blair Witch Project had a huge impact on tourism to that small town that we see at the beginning of the film,
Right.
to an extent that fans, would jump into gardens, go to the cemetery to pick up some mementos. I believe there were thousands of people coming into this town in the middle of nowhere, that most people would have never heard of before. Or the city of Bruges in Belgium, which was the main character in the thriller In Bruges with Colin Farrell, saw a huge uptick in tourism.
Mm-hmm.
It's about murders, prostitutes, drugs. And you'd think, as a destination marketeer, oh my God, this is a catastrophe. But the opposite happened.
Right. Well, I mean, the funny thing you bring up Blair Witch Project is people who are regulars listening to our podcast here know that most of the producing and directing team from the Blair Witch Project is actually from Florida and from Central Florida. And so we know them pretty well. And I mean, your point about whether or not the subject matter on screen positive, if it is not necessarily a positive message, how that also impacts. Another example here in Florida is going back, 40 years to when Miami Vice, the television series, came on. It freaked people out down in South Florida because they thought, wait, we don't want cops speeding through our streets dealing with drugs. And yet now here we are 40 years later, and the image of South Florida is still etched in people's in people's minds because of what they saw on Miami Vice with the colors and the palm trees and the beaches, and people still think of that, and it resonates 40 years later, regardless of the messaging that was on screen.
That's right. Yeah. And I believe, wasn't there a reunion just a few months ago?
Yes, there was.
Miami
There
Vice. Yeah.
absolutely was. Yes, a number of the casting crew kind of got back together for the 40th anniversary. Yeah, good catch on that one. So we've talked a lot about how locations benefit from film tourism, but how can film and television projects themselves benefit from considering tourism while developing their films?
So essentially, when we talk about filmmaking, I would say the bottom line is you never have enough money
Right.
unless perhaps you are, one of the big studios or streamers. But essentially, you never have enough money. So here's a way of potentially unlocking some more dollars. Think about, as a producer, production company, what you can give as an I pay to a region. And what I mean by that is, for instance, can they use some of your set photos for promotion purposes, or some of your stills that you will be using anyway for marketing purposes? We're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of photos. 3, 4, 5 shots, that's enough. If you allow them to, for instance, interview some of your key cast, or if that's not possible, I know that's often tricky in terms of the right situation, the director and the producer. So if the director producer sees something lovely about your region, you're much more inclined to open the coffers and say, well, if you give us some IP in return, we might give you some discounts on accommodation or other services. So it is about collaborating with your local or regional film office, I believe, from early on. Pitch the idea of a film tourism collaboration, and I would believe you're bound to get some extra dollars for your project. It might not be much, but as we know, sometimes it really comes down to the last dollar to get your film financed.
Yeah. Now, we've talked about a lot of different examples, but are there major differences between large market regions, small market regions, when it comes to approaches people take with film tourism?
I would say that the approach is always the same, and that is, try to collaborate with a production company as early as possible. See if they are open to a joint campaign, or you using the IP for tourism promotion purposes. Obviously, if it's a national film commission, they would have a much higher budget than a regional film office.
Sure.
So I would say it is very beneficial to have a joint approach. So as a regional film office, talk to your national body, screen body, find out what they're doing. If they're not doing anything around a tourism campaign, see if they're open to it. Talk to your tourism colleagues, obviously. My experience is that tourism organizations tend to have much higher budgets than film commissions or film offices.
Yes.
So it makes perfect sense to collaborate. So you might be able to bring in that knowledge of how to do film tourism as a film officer or film commissioner. Your tourism colleagues might not, but they have the infrastructure, they have the budget, and it's actually their remit to attract tourists. It's not in the remit of a film office or film commission.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, Stefan, where can people learn more about you, your work, film tourism? Where can people learn more?
I've got a website called FilmQuest. That's the name of my consulting company, www.filmquest.co. I'm on LinkedIn, so just get in touch. And, it's my passion topic. It always will be. And yeah, I love working in this area. It's very meaningful, as I see it, very immersive. And I believe that there's more to be done in terms of improving experiences.
Yeah. I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us today on film tourism. As much as I've learned about film tourism through the years, I certainly am much smarter today after talking with you about the subject. Thanks so much for being on the Film Florida podcast.
Thanks, John. It was great. Loved it.
Thanks for listening to the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org and like or follow our social media pages. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. Please also consider going to our website and donating $20.25 for our 2025 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator-spring.com, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.